This is my presentation on indigenous populations and the effects of deculturalization and systemic racism on this population. This is a topic, deculturalization, that is important for us to study and educate ourselves about in order to prevent history from repeating itself, and in order for us to truly create social justice. We're going to look at specifically in this presentation the Native American experience, and the purpose of this presentation is to not only highlight the different highlight the history, but also relate it with our own experiences. I would like to relate it with my own experience, and also to hopefully pave a path forward for a better future. So what is deculturalization? First and foremost is the forced removal of a cultural identity. Culture is essentially our background, the things that influence how we behave, what we value, our beliefs. All of these things are part of our culture. And so deculturalization is an imposed removal of culture by another culture that is dominant. And because the other culture is dominant, is in a position of power, they have the ability to take away minorities' culture. An example of that would be language suppression. Language is part of our culture, the way that we communicate, the words that we use, and also forced assimilation. So forcing the suppressed culture to assimilate and pretty much identify with a foreign culture. This is a global phenomenon. It's not something that's specific to Native Americans, but it was quite unfortunately negatively impactful on Native Americans. So from a historical perspective, the Native American deculturalization, it took place by or due to the European colonies. So the English, along with the other European along with the other Europeans, came and colonized the Americas, and uh, they forced the native population to assimilate to their culture, their way of doing things, their government, their language, and they created these policies targeting the indigenous identity, removing their religion, their values, their way of governing themselves, and not only that, they wish to produce a new generation of Native Americans that were Native American in terms of their blood or their physical characteristics, but they wanted them to be, at least from the inside, Europeans. And so for that, they created these Native American boarding schools, which we'll talk about in an upcoming slide. Also important to point out here is the impact of the Dawes Act. It was an act that took away land from the Native Americans and gave settlers the right to occupy or actually buy and control those lands, while also allotting a fair amount of land, or I shouldn't say a fair amount of land, but an amount of land for natives as well as for their own individual ownership. Quite a dark experience. Native American boarding schools. These boarding schools, they forced children from away from their families into these boarding schools, separating parents from their children, separating the children from their parents and their caregivers, and quite ruthlessly, I would say. In these boarding schools, there was a prohibition of indigenous language and traditions. Assimilation essentially was mandatory. And if someone were to go against that, the students that had no power, there were harsh punishments for practicing their culture. And finally, these boarding schools, they left a long-term negative impact on the identity and mental health of the precious students that went to these boarding schools. So the effect of deculturalization was uh, pretty much entirely negative. After coming back from these boarding schools and coming into these communities where they were brought up, where their ancestors were brought up, where they had a culture, had a way of life, now coming back into those communities, it was quite difficult for these students to come back to their communities in due to many different reasons. One of them being that there was a loss of language. They didn't speak the same language as their ancestors, their caregivers, their parents, even, and also a lack of cultural knowledge. How are they expected to behave? What are the values? What are the beliefs? In addition to the psychological trauma and the intergenerational struggles that these populations unfortunately had to endure. Coming back to these colonized lands, they had severe disadvantages, educational disadvantages, because they were being taught in a language that they didn't fully understand. They were taught a culture that they didn't uh, understands understand, and the policies that shaped life in that era um, made it quite difficult for them to advance economically as well. In addition to all of that, the deculturalization process, it unfortunately marginalized the Native American identity, and so as a culture and as a people and on an individual level, these people they suffered, and they began to look at their own identity and culture as being something that wasn't enough, that was trivial, that was something that was perhaps holding them back. So maybe we might assume that we've advanced as a people and there aren't that many modern day challenges. However, we would be wrong in assuming these things. There are continuous stereotypes and media misrepresentation, especially in regards to Native Americans, but not only Native Americans, stereotypes with other minorities as well. There's cultural suppression in education. Native Americans are not allowed to express their culture, whatever it's spoken about. Oftentimes, it's not spoken about enough, or there's too much misinformation or disinformation. There also continues to be between generally most minorities and uh, their Caucasian peers, economic and social disparities. And so we see people from Caucasian backgrounds, they're more likely to succeed economically, earn more, and occupy greater post of power as well. And there continues to be a struggle for cultural and land rights. There's litigation. There's different things that still continue to take place in the 21st century. In 2025, there are numerous tribes that have ancestral rights to certain land that is currently being occupied by different, perhaps, organization or people. With that said, is the future so murky? Is it dark? Is there any hope? And I would say yes, there is definitely hope. There are native language programs in school, and now, due to cultural awareness and a push for social justice, different minorities are learning their own language in public schools. There are, as I mentioned earlier, legal battles for Indigenous rights, and hopefully we can give those people their rights to the land that their ancestors occupied. And there's also a preservation of traditions and ceremonies and recognition on a federal and even on a state level. And also those populations that we've identified, those pockets that we've identified in which Native Americans uh, can live, we the government and policies are being developed to strengthen their own ability to govern themselves. So taking all of that into account, we would say that the path forward is to continue to support Indigenous education and initiatives. Along with other minorities, we want to support their education, we want to respect their culture, and help them learn more about their own culture, their own language, and their own way of life. We want to advocate for accurate representation in media. Anything that is that is negative, the prejudice and stereotypes, we want to eliminate that from media. Going forward, obviously requires a lot of respect for the way that they conduct themselves, Indigenous populations and Native Americans, the way they conduct themselves, their values and beliefs, and really learning from them more than judging them. And lastly, learn about and acknowledge historical injustice as this presentation aimed to do. This presentation was, as I said in the beginning, difficult for me to do just because of the atrocities that I had to study. But we need to raise awareness and we need to acknowledge the injustices suffered by all populations, including the Native American population.